Hello and welcome back to this Vulkan programming series. Our goal for this tutorial is to create a cube map. A cube map is just another word for a background in a 3D environment. I've modified this texture cube map project to look like the texture project we made last time. So what do we need to create a cube map? We need a texture, we need a mesh, and the cube map will have its own descriptor, its own pipeline, and its own uniform buffer. So the first step is we should create a texture for the cube map. This is very similar to the way we created a texture in the last tutorial. So we can start off by making a Vulkan texture object, and this object embodies the structure, the texture structure from the last tutorial. You see it contains the descriptor and the sampler, just like last time. And then we can name this Cubemap. And also we need a descriptor handle to create our descriptor for our texture. And we can name this Skybox. Skybox and Cubemap do mean slightly different things, but for this tutorial, you can just assume they mean the same thing. So let's go to allocate a descriptor from the descriptor pool. So here we can see the uniform buffer and the combined image sampler for the texture object. So now we need one more for our Cubemap object. And this number right here, max sets, can stay the same because we only have two types. We still only have uniform buffers and combined image samplers. Our descriptor layout is fine as it is. I haven't changed anything since the last tutorial. And the last thing we need is to actually write the descriptor set. So we can go ahead and take what he has right here and write a new descriptor for our skybox. Alright, so we only have to change a few things. Here it says that when we allocate our descriptor sets, right here we're allocating the texture object descriptor. So we want to do the skybox descriptor. Again, here we're doing the same thing. Here we're doing the same thing. And here, since we're using the uniform buffer, we want to create a handle for that, or an object. So here we have our texture object uniform buffer. So now we just want to create our skybox vertex structure. Okay, so we can change this skybox vertex structure. And you would think that we just have our cube map texture and then we call it descriptor. But in this case, since it's a cube map, we need a special descriptor. In the last tutorial, this is what we did, but we need an image descriptor. And then we can name it Cubemap descriptor. And then we call this function that he's given us descriptor image info. So the parameters for this function is the sampler. So we want the sampler of the Vulkan texture of the cube map. So we go down, we use its sampler. And then we need its view, so we get the view for that. And then the image layout is just going to be general. We don't need a special image layout. And then we can simply just call this descriptor instead of, or for the cube map. Cubemap descriptor. And another thing, since we've already created this right descriptor sets vector, we don't have to create it again. So we can get rid of that. Alright, so now that we've created our descriptor, we want to create our, one more thing is, since we've just created our descriptor, we can now actually load the texture file. So here we have a texture loading object for a texture loading class in our base files. Right here it says Vulkan texture loader. So we just want to load our Cubemap texture. Here, load the Cubemap, and then so get asset path takes us to our data folder right here. So we want to go into textures, and then we want to go into Cubemap Yokohama. So we want to go into, this was textures, right? Cubemap Yokohama. Yeah, Yokohama's in Japan, by the way. And then the last parameter says it's a reference to the Vulkan texture, and we've named our texture Cubemap. So now that we've loaded our texture file, our Cubemap texture file, we can create the mesh. So a mesh is basically just a 3D object that hasn't been filled in with polygons yet. So we start off by creating this mesh object, and we can name it Skybox. And also this is for our texture object, but our texture object isn't actually a mesh. I'm just using it for the vertices and indices, but yeah, our texture object isn't actually using a mesh, so you can just kind of ignore this. And so another thing for meshes is we can't use this vertex structure anymore. We have to have a special vertex layout for meshes. So So we want vertex layout position. And then we want vertex layout texture coordinate. So notice that it's the same as this. We have position and we have texture coordinates, but this is specifically just for meshes, since we cannot use this for meshes. Alright, so now we want to create our pipeline for our mesh. So a pipeline basically just gives properties for our meshes. And we'll talk about pipelines in a future video also. So we go into our prepare pipelines function. And so to create a pipeline for our Cubemap object, so right now this is our pipeline for our texture object. So all of these parameters are okay for our Cubemap object. This is texture. So all of these parameters are okay for our Cubemap object. We just want to change specific parameters such as depth. We don't need depth for our background because, like, let's say we have a sky in the background. We don't want to be able to like pass the sky. And also cull mode for our texture object. we don't have any culling, so we can see both sides of the texture object. But if we had a background, which is our cube map, we would want to cull the back of the cube map, because we're never going to be able to see like the back of the sky. So it's basically just wasting performance for us. And also the last thing, we want to change the shaders, obviously. So after we've just created our texture object pipeline, we can go and create, and also our shaders are in, let's just look really quickly. So data, that's get acid path, and then our shaders. So we're going into Cubemap, and then it's skybox. We can ignore these reflects. So Cubemap. And then skybox. And then the next thing we said was the depth. So the depth stencil state. And the parameters it is depth test enable and depth right enable. So here it is, depth test enable. And we can just take this. Depth right enable. And so the last thing we said was the cull mode, so rasterization state. Again, we're doing this because this is our background, and we'll never be able to see the back. Okay. We'll never be able to see the back of the background, so we can just get rid of those polygons. So that's what this is doing here. So after we've just changed those parameters, we can basically derive from this pipeline. It's not a derivative, it's not a child of the pipeline, but we still have all of these parameters that are set for the texture object pipeline. We've only changed the depth, the shaders, and the cull mode. And now we already made our pipeline object, so we can call that. So now we want to make our uniform buffer, and we already made the object. So we can go into our prepare uniform buffers, take the 3D object buffer. A uniform buffer is basically just, it gives our meshes properties again, but it's more like rotation and like being able to move and manipulate our objects. So it's not like the pipeline, which gives it like visual qualities. So here our parameter is usage. It's a uniform buffer. Next parameter is memory property flags, host visible and host coherent. This is about staging buffers, and we don't really need to know this for this tutorial. The only thing we really need to change is these right here. And then after we've prepared the uniform buffers, we can update the buffers. We can take this. And the only thing we really need to change for our skybox uniform buffer, one, it says we're creating this again, but we don't have to create it again. This variable too, we don't have to create it again. We have to change the skybox vs. So right now we're just changing it from the skybox, or from the texture object vertex structure to the skybox vertex structure for mapping the memory, copying the memory, and then unmapping it again. So that all looks okay. And then the one parameter we do need to change is this. So we don't want the camera position. We just want it to be 0, 0, 0. And the best way for me to describe why we do this is, let's say we take this right here, this vec3, and we put it for our texture object. So that would make it so we can still rotate our texture object like last time. We can still zoom in and out of our texture object just like last time, but we can't actually move the object side to side or left to right. So that's the difference between these two. Okay, so so we created the uniform buffer. So now we need to load the mesh since we just created the mesh. So we can load the mesh. So the file name. So we want to get the asset path like we always do. And the asset path brings us to the data folder once again. And since we're using a mesh in this case, we go to the models, and we're going to be using this cube object file. So we go to models, and then, yeah. The next parameter is the mesh buffer. We've already created that, and we named it skybox. It's talking about this right here. This would be our mesh buffer. And then the vertex layout, which is only useful for our meshes. And then this last parameter, I don't really know why it's this integer, but apparently that's the mesh create info. We can look inside, like, let me look. Yeah, I honestly don't know why, but our mesh, what is it? Yeah, our mesh info is 0.5. Okay, so now that we're done creating the mesh, we can go into the destructor. And I've already written it out because we don't really need to know how to like memorize this or anything. But basically what we're doing is we're destroying the image view, the image, the sampler, and then we're freeing the memory of the Cubemap texture. And then we're destroying the pipeline of the Cubemap. And then we're destroying the mesh, the actual mesh, and then we're destroying the uniform buffer. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is the shaders, right? Yeah, so we can go into our data folder, shaders, and we have two sets of shaders now, right? Because one of our pipelines uses our texture shaders, and this is perfectly fine. We can use the same one that we made from last time, and now we need a new shader called skybox, and it's in our Cubemap, and we can ignore these reflects, and we just open these two. All right, so in our vertex shader, so in our vertex shader, let's see. So we need we take in our position, and then we put out put out our texture coordinates. This is also a 3-component vector. And then we set these equal to each other. We set the position equal to the texture coordinates. And then in our fragment shader, we can just take the layout. This is our sampler from our Cubemap. And then we can take in our texture coordinates. Now we can set our frag color. So we want it to be a texture, and then we input the sampler Cubemap and our texture coordinates. So these are very basic shaders for our Cubemap. Oh, wait. And then don't forget to generate the sphere V shader. And then now we can hope that it works. Hold on one sec. I wonder why it's not showing anything. That's strange. Wow. Okay, it's not showing anything. If we rebuild it? Oh. Okay, one more thing. I forgot to build the command buffers. So we're building the texture object right here, but we forgot to build our skybox object. That's my bad. And so all we do is we bind the descriptors, we bind the vertex buffers, we bind the index buffer, and then we bind the pipeline, and then we draw the cube or the Cubemap. So again, it's taking our texture object descriptor. We want the skybox descriptor. Here it's taking the texture object mesh. We want the skybox mesh. Here's the same thing. It's taking from the texture object pipeline. We want the skybox pipeline. And here's the same thing also. Okay, I think it, oh. Oh, it's, I mean, it's correct, but it's a little small. Well, this is a good, it's in the correct position. Yeah, I don't know why this is, I think we did something wrong. It's probably in our uniform buffers. Yeah, so, well, I mean, this shows us like we cull the back of the texture. So notice how it like, it's almost see-through in the front, but you can see everything in the back. Yeah. So that's an example of culling. And also you can see how a Cubemap, it's literally just a cube over our camera. But in this case, it's over our texture object, which is incorrect. But I think we can so perspective, this is fine. Translate. Is it? Oh, I don't even think we need translate actually. Yeah, I don't think. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, there. Okay, so next time we'll be looking at texture arrays, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.